Welcome, everybody, to our special talk. My name is Marion Danzeisen, and on behalf of the German-American Center here in Stuttgart and the University of Hohenheim, we would like to welcome all of you to our event, Irony and Outrage, with Professor Dannagal G. We are so glad that so many of you decided to join us once again for our virtual event. And before I officially get to introduce our guest, just some housekeeping rules. We will start with a talk by Professor Young that's going to last about 40 to 45 minutes. And afterwards, we would like to engage all of you at home as well. So as usual, please send us your questions via the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible after the talk. Please note, as always, that the chat function will be disabled during this event and that you will not be able to turn on your microphones or your cameras. So our guest today is an associate professor of communication and political science and international relations at the University of Delaware, where she studies the intersection of entertainment and information, including the effects of shows like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. She has recently published her book, Irony and Outrage, The Polarized Landscape of Rage, Fear, and Laughter in the US, where she discusses the psychological differences between liberals and conservatives in the US and how they manifest themselves through the kinds of media we prefer to consume. And this is also what she'll be talking about today to all of you at home. She is currently working on a new book called Wrong, focusing on misinformation and disinformation. So maybe we can invite her back at some point in the future to share her new findings with us. There's also a virtual class with her coming up on propaganda and persuasions at the Great Courses. You can find a lot of interesting podcasts with her, articles, etc. And there's also an excellent TED Talk that she's given that you can find online. And what's, of course, especially interesting for us here in Stuttgart is that Dana's father was actually stationed here with the US Army from 1962 to 63, if that's correct. And so there's already a personal connection here that we are very excited about. And of course, we would have loved to have you on stage here in Stuttgart, but since we can't, Dana, please imagine a big round of applause as we welcome you to our virtual stage. And I'm handing it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marion. That was a lovely introduction. And my father has very fond memories of his time in Stuttgart in the early 1960s. That was his sort of last wild hurrah before he went back to the United States and met my mother. And they're still married and live in New Hampshire. And he says hello because he's very excited that I'm doing this today. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about the two main genres that occupy our political information space in the United States right now. But to get to that conversation, I need to tell you a little bit about how I started asking these questions that brought me down this road. I started at the University of Pennsylvania for graduate school in 1999, and it was the very same year that Jon Stewart, the comedian, took over as host of The Daily Show on Comedy Central. And up until that time, the show had been not that political, but it became increasingly political as Jon Stewart took over. So that coincided with my starting graduate school. I thought, there aren't a lot of people who are studying this. There are not a lot of people studying the impact of political satire on beliefs, attitudes, or opinions. And it was a wonderful opportunity to sort of make my mark in this new area. Especially after the events of September 11th, 2001, and then the United States involvement in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And Jon Stewart on The Daily Show had a very strong point of view about the United States' engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the content of his show was very political. So I did experiments and surveys studying the effects of what happens when you watch these shows to your beliefs, your opinions, your behaviors. And every time I presented this work over the course of about 20 years, folks would ask me, why is it that all political satire in the United States is so liberal? And I could not escape the question. It was asked every time I did a radio interview, anytime I presented research at an academic conference. And you have to ask, is that actually true? Is it true that the hosts of late night television programs are predominantly liberal? Well, if you look at the landscape right now, the answer is yes. So right here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with all of these hosts, but some of the big ones, across the top, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, and Bill Maher. And on the bottom, Seth Meyers, Trevor Noah, who's the new host of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Then, of course, Conan O'Brien, and Samantha Bee, who she got her start on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, as did one who's not here, which is John Oliver. So John Oliver, who you may know, who's on HBO, he also got his start on The Daily Show. So yeah, all of these hosts, their point of view is very progressive. They tend to be liberal on social and cultural issues, and even on some fiscal issues. This is not just a question that I've been asked at conferences. This is a question that journalists have been asking for a long time. There have been many articles in the United States, in the American press, why it is that conservative comedy doesn't work. Is that fair to say? Is that true? There was an article called Waiting for the Conservative Jon Stewart. Why does every conservative Daily Show fail? Why can't right-wing comics break into late night television? And then this one, which is probably the most harsh, why aren't conservatives funny? So before I started accepting the premise that satire is liberal, I had to think, has this always been true? In the American context, has satire always leaned to the left? And when you look at the roots of American satire, you need to look into the mid to late 1950s. So in the late 1950s, you have what are called counterculture comics. On the top left is Lenny Bruce, who was made famous by his satire sets that were in strip clubs and coffee houses. Dick Gregory, Mort Saul, and in the bottom right, the Smothers Brothers, who had a television show from 1968 to 69, who themselves were anti-war, anti-Nixon, and they were also very progressive. So it is fair to say that by and large, with some exceptions, satire in the US context has been quite liberal. So why is that? Why is it that satire is liberal? Many have sought to answer this question. Stephen Colbert, who you may know because now he hosts one of the late night shows in the United States, he says, going after the status quo is not a conservative thing to do. It's antithetical to the idea of conservatism. Comedy is about change, so comedy is going to be a challenge for conservatives. And I bought this. I thought this makes sense to me. For a long time I thought maybe that's it. Comedy is about change. Conservatives support the status quo. But this was complicated by the fact that we had, for 8 years, a liberal president. By the way, I look at this picture and I think, wow, the presidency really ages a person.
Dana,
Yeah.
can I briefly interrupt you because I don't see your presentation and I think you still need to share the screen. I just got feedback from the audience because you're talking about the pictures and it would be great if we could
Oh my goodness!
if you could see them.
I thought that I had already had it shared. I apologize.
That's fine. I wasn't sure if you already started, but now that you're referring to pictures.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
I thought, no, I'm so sorry. I thought that I had it shared this entire time. Here, hold on one second. I am so... Thank you for letting me know.
Sorry. All right, now I can see your screen.
Great, okay. Okay.
Yes.
Goodness me. Okay. These were the late night comedy hosts that were the ones that I was alluding to that you could not see. These are the ones who are popular today. Here are the headlines I was referring to about how conservative comedy doesn't work. And here are the hosts of some of the late night comics and satirists from the late 1950s, who I was referring to earlier. So as I said, in terms of how we're going to answer this question, why is it that this happens, Stephen Colbert says it's about change. Comedy's about change. Conservatives support the status quo. Therefore, they're not going to use jokes and, criticize the status quo in that way. So as the Obama presidency rolled on, and this is the picture I was telling you about where, my goodness, the presidency ages a person. When you think about the sort of challenges to the Obama presidency over the course of those 8 years, okay? At some point, for the first 2 years, it was a Democratic presidency, Democratic Senate, Democratic Congress. They held all three. Over time, under President Obama, the United States passed many different pieces of progressive legislation. And at some point, it did feel like the entire country was on this sort of steady march towards progressivism. So at some point, I thought, does that trajectory then become the status quo? Does this sort of liberal, progressive ethos become the norm? Here's the thing. Throughout this entire 8-year period, there was a lot of political satire. There were a lot of late-night comedy jokes. Not a lot of them were made targeting President Obama, nor were many of them made targeting his policies. Okay? However, that is not to say that he did not have his critics. Of course Obama had his critics. But his critics were not using satire as their weapon of choice. His critics were using a genre that I'm going to describe called outrage. Fox News is probably the best example of outrage in the United States. Here we have Sean Hannity, who spent a lot of time talking about President Obama early on, criticizing him for being elite and eating fancy mustard. Then there were questions about whether or not Barack Obama was actually born in the United States. Of course, those questions were pushed by, before he was president, Trump. Questions about whether or not Obama is a Muslim. Now, he is not a Muslim. He was born in the United States. He was born in Hawaii, which is part of the United States. Now, it didn't stop these sort of criticisms from coming out, especially on certain kinds of political talk shows, especially on Fox News. And political talk is also something that we have on radio shows. So there are a lot of conservative radio shows in the United States that lean to the right politically. And one of the most famous hosts of that genre was Rush Limbaugh, who recently passed away. So as Fox News took aim at President Obama, it was very clear that it was successful for them. Their network did very well financially through the Obama presidency. Obviously, you're going to have profit growth in cable news programming in general, right, as people are interested in politics, etc. So you have CNN and MSNBC experiencing some growth, but not to the extent that Fox News Channel experienced their growth. These profit margins were growing mainly not because of the straight news shows that do air on Fox News, but because of the opinion shows, what they call analysis shows, that air on Fox News. One of the most popular on the network still is Sean Hannity. So now let me, in case you haven't watched this kind of programming, let me explain what the programming looks like. So these are shows that are hosted by one person. They have a strong point of view. They identify the threats in the environment. They tell you who you should be angry at or what you should be angry at, and they tell you what to do about it. They often use exaggeration and hyperbole to make their points. And one of the very popular, long-standing features of Sean Hannity's coverage was a focus on what he called the deep state. And that is, in the early years of the Trump presidency, he spent a lot of time talking about how there are unelected bureaucrats in Washington that are part of these government agencies who have been around a very long time, and that there's a giant conspiracy to try to undermine President Trump and make his administration fail. And they were called the deep state. Hannity still talks about the deep state, that there are these entities that have it as their mission to move the government in a socialist direction. And especially under the Trump presidency, to complicate Trump's life and make it difficult for him to get things done. Remember how I said that in order to look at whether or not political satire is liberal, I had to look back at the roots of political satire that rest in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Interestingly, at that same time, late 50s, early 60s, there was the first iteration of the conservative political talk genre as well. At that very time, that satirists like Lenny Bruce were in coffee houses talking about atheism and questioning sort of sexual mores, you had hosts on the radio who were conservative like Dan Smoot, who also were railing against socialism, the United States' participation in the United Nations, what they perceived as a very liberal Supreme Court. This quote from Dan Smoot is perfect. This was from, I think, 1958. And he said, "Somewhere at the top of the pyramid in the invisible government are a few sinister people who know exactly what they're doing. They want America to become part of a worldwide socialist dictatorship." I don't know about you, but to me this sounds an awful lot like the deep state. This very same thing that Sean Hannity's talking about now is something Dan Smoot was talking about 70 years ago. 70 years ago? 60 to 70 years ago. So if you're interested in these genres, the conservative media genre, I have two recommendations for books to look at. Messengers of the Right looks at the history of the conservative radio movement in the United States and traces it through the development of Fox News. On the right, the outrage industry talks about what this genre of programming looks like, the genre of outrage, and helps us define it and quantify it and talks about why it is so financially successful in the US. So an important year in the story of satire and outrage is the year of 1996. I was actually living in France in 1996, but that is not relevant, except that it's your neighbor. So in that year, we have, within 3 months of each other, we have the templates for what would become television staples. That was the birth of the original Daily Show before Jon Stewart hosted. This was with Craig Kilborn, developed as a parody show of cable news. The show itself was developed at that time and gave a template for news parody and satire. 3 months later was the birth of the Fox News channel. And one of the hosts who was with Fox News for a very long time is Bill O'Reilly. He left the network because of sexual harassment allegations several years ago. But his show, The O'Reilly Report, later called The Factor, The O'Reilly Factor, his show really sort of perfected that outrage genre. Okay, but why? What is it about 1996 that makes these things arise in that moment? To understand that, we need to understand two things. We need to, on the one hand, political and journalistic context, and on the other hand, media technologies and developments in media technologies. So these are big, broad ideas that I develop a lot in the book. Each one gets one slide in the hopes that we can have a good understanding of the backdrop for this. So in the 80s and 90s in the United States, mass media industries were completely deregulated, meaning there were no limits on the number of media outlets that a particular corporation could own. There were fewer restrictions on what could be said on the air. We used to have rules in the United States about how you had to give both sides of an argument on broadcast. It was called the Fairness Doctrine. That was repealed in 1987, meaning you can just tell one side of the story if you want. You are not obligated to tell the other side of the story. At the same time, because of this consolidation of ownership And these large corporations realized that they could acquire multiple media companies and make exponential profits. There was a shift towards news that would generate ratings and profit. The United States does not have the robust public media system that countries and democratic nations enjoy across Western Europe. The United States does not have that, largely because we are so rooted in a libertarian press because of the need for separation and freedom of the press, freedom of expression. We fear the partnership between government and journalism. Even if the journalism is only funded by the government but is allowed to continue independent of government, we still, as a culture, are generally suspicious of that. So our news organizations are privately owned. We do have public media, but it is not hugely consumed and it is not hugely funded. So our large media corporations consolidated to the point where we now only have 5. We have 5 large media corporations that own 95% of the content that is consumed in our media ecosystem. And by the way, as news became more profit-oriented, it shifted how news was produced to give people what they would want so that they would watch, as opposed to perhaps what citizens would need for a functioning democracy. At the same time, there was a reduction in trust in news. Now, it's very hard to say if that drop in trust was necessarily because of the shift in favor of ratings and profit, but there is a strong case to be made. We also experienced reduced trust in government over that same period of time, out of the 1970s into the 1990s. The United States was really reeling after the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s. And our involvement in the Vietnam War was really something that was challenging for a lot of Americans because there were inaccurate and overly positive reports of how the United States was doing in the Vietnam War, and that ended up not being true. So that also eroded trust in government at that time. And then starting in 1994, starting at the level of Congress, the United States' 2 political parties became increasingly ideologically polarized. The Republicans in 1994 had a very strongly conservative platform. Democrats then replied in kind, and the ideological positions of the parties on issues became increasingly polarized, and members of Congress became less likely to compromise with members of the other party to pass legislation. This happened at the elite level, but then what happened next? The public also began to get more polarized, but not necessarily just on the issues. Because for the public, politics is very much about identity. What team am I on? Am I a Democrat or am I a Republican? So the real catastrophic effect for the public was what we call affective polarization, where members of the parties are more and more likely to hate the other side. So much so that now in the United States, the group that people are most worried about their children marrying are members of the opposing political party. That is how affectively polarized we've become. So that's one set of factors. On the other side, you have these amazing technological developments happening in the 80s and 90s. You have the birth of cable television. In 1982 and 1983, we saw CNN, MTV, Black Entertainment Television. All of these cable stations became possible because of the technology of cable. We were no longer limited by just the frequency of the broadcast spectra. Now, through cable technologies, you can have many different channels. What's important about this is that it's not just the availability of channels. What's most important is the economics of the media system that accompanied this. not a lot of people think about this, but for me, this is everything. And Joseph Thoreau's book here, Breaking Up America, does a wonderful job explaining the implications of this. As there became more and more channels, that meant that audiences got tinier and tinier, little tiny audiences. So how are you, as a network executive, going to sell your audience to an advertiser, right? Because that is what sustains the entire system. You used to be able to say, well, here at NBC, we have just about a third of the viewing public, you know? But now, with cable technologies, you can't say that anymore. So how are you going to sell those audiences to advertisers? Well, you're going to explain that because you have created content that is appealing to a certain kind of person, you have efficiently separated one kind of consumer into one little space where they're easy to find and easy to target. And two, you're going to explain that you have developed a special relationship with that viewer because you've created programming just for them. So there's a trusting relationship between the programming and the audience. So when you put your advertisement in this programming, they'll be more likely to be responsive and want to purchase whatever it is you're selling. So this resulted in the strategic development of these tiny audiences to sell to advertisers. So how are you going to create tiny audiences? You're going to separate them on demographics, race, age, interests. How else can you separate them? Politics? Of course. Politics becomes a very easy categorical marker. So my argument is that that is what resulted in these two different genres that we see rise through the 90s into the 2000s. Political satire on the one hand, which does two things. One, it is a way of experimenting with new formats to come up with a new kind of quasi-political content that answers the public's call for new kinds of political information. Because remember, the public is not trusting news. They're less likely to trust the news. They are politically polarized. They're very hard to please because they see neutral information as biased against their side. So they're increasingly wanting information that agrees with their worldview. Okay? So, on the one hand, there is satire, which critiques politics and the press, and it does it with irony. It does it with play, ambiguity. It's all silly and fun. It's experimental. Irony here, when I talk about irony, I mean saying the opposite of what you actually mean. So making an argument where its literal meaning and its inverted meaning or ironic meaning are different, and you have to know that the audience is going to reconcile that properly, make sense of that. The second genre, of course, is outrage, where they are critiquing politics and the press, but they're doing it through really straight, clear, didactic, exaggerated speech. They're identifying threats. They are not joking. They are totally serious, and they are never going to make it seem like they're joking. So as I came away from this, I thought this is fascinating because you have conservatives answering all of these different factors with conservative political opinion talk or outrage. And you have liberals doing it with jokes. So why do these genres look and feel so different? Why does Stephen Colbert make jokes with no pants on, while Sean Hannity is trying to scare the heck out of you to take action against the liberals who are taking over? Why do they look so different? In order to answer this question, we turn to political psychology. There are many books here that are absolutely wonderful if you want a deep dive into the psychological differences between liberals and conservatives. Liberals and conservatives, especially social and cultural liberals and conservatives, are very different, especially on matters relating to how we monitor and deal with threats. Threat and the role of threat in our environment is largely considered to be what separates liberals and conservatives and why liberals and conservatives have different psychological traits. So chief among these traits, and what is at the heart of my research, are the traits of tolerance for ambiguity. That is, how comfortable are you with uncertainty? Are you okay with situations that are unpredictable or novel? Are you okay with contexts that are unclear or ambiguous? And the other is need for cognition, which is how much you enjoy thinking just for the sake of thinking. What's important, need for cognition is not about how smart you are. You can be smart and be low in need for cognition. They are correlated, but need for cognition is more about your enjoyment of thinking, how motivated you are to think. So the reason I have these two pictures here is because this is my caricature or stereotype of what the world looks like for conservatives, shown here on the left, and liberals, shown here on the right. For conservatives who are monitoring for threat, who are concerned about threats in their environment, they experience the world motivated to do things efficiently and motivated for survival. As a result, they are all about quick decisions and efficiency. They are not tolerant of ambiguity. They do not like uncertainty. They do not like novelty. They are really good at making decisions quickly and consistently. On this side, this is supposed to be, I don't know, this is like a kid's restaurant where they have you jump in the balls and you just explore, and the whole floor is padded with rubber so you'll never get hurt. This is a life of a liberal, because you're not concerned about threat. You're never going to get hurt. You're not monitoring for threats. The whole world is just there for you to explore and play. You don't have to be concerned about the threats. So that frees you up to what? To be okay with uncertainty. Be okay with unpredictability. Be motivated to think for the sake of thinking. You don't have to be efficient. You don't have to be an efficient decision maker if you're not monitoring for threat. You can think all day long if you want. Now, a lot of times we social psychologists get criticized for making it seem as though these traits, tolerance for ambiguity and need for cognition, are normatively the better traits. That there is a liberal bias to this work, right? Because even the names of them, they seem good. Tolerance seems good. Cognition seems good. But I always say be careful, because if you've ever been in a university faculty meeting where you are surrounded by people who are high in tolerance for ambiguity and high in need for cognition, you know that there's real danger to that combination, because no one can make a decision. If you need to take action and you're trying to survive, these traits are not what you need. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that there's not a sense of what's good and what's bad, okay? Okay. So in terms of where these come from, I won't spend too much time here, but obviously there's nature and nurture. There's biology, physiology, and genetics that are playing a role here. And there are environmental factors here in terms of how you were raised, how you were socialized, perhaps what traumas you endure. All of these things are going to shape how you interact with the world and monitor for threat. Are you thinking about mortality? Are you worried about mortality? How are you going to respond to those things? Those are the core features that are then going to shape these psychological traits, which then will shape how you process information, how you're motivated, whether it be to be efficient or to be accurate. And this is what's fascinating to me, is that these information processing goals, they might shape your political views and attitudes, but they also might shape your preferences for different kinds of art and expression, and I'm going to unpack how that is. So if you are someone who's high in tolerance for ambiguity and you don't monitor for threat and you're high in need for cognition, you are more likely to be okay with open immigration plans. You are more supportive of abortion rights. You are more tolerant of gay marriage and transgender rights, and you are more liberal on matters of racial policy. Okay? So all of this is about social and cultural ideology. Whereas if you are monitoring for threats, as a social and cultural conservative, of course, you are more about closed borders, opposition to abortion, opposition to gay marriage, and perhaps less interested in these issues of racial justice. At the same time, these very same traits that might contribute to these policy positions, tolerance for ambiguity, need for cognition, have been found to shape how much we appreciate different kinds of art. And this is when I thought, this is it. This is the nugget right here. On the left, abstract art by Picasso. On the right, realistic art. Conservatives, believe it or not, are more likely to reject abstract art than liberals. Social and cultural conservatives are more likely to reject abstract art. They show a higher preference for realistic art, and a lot of that is explained through the trait of openness and tolerance for ambiguity. And need for cognition, because conservatives are more likely to want to be able to understand it and appreciate it quickly. They reject the abstract art. And maybe you can guess where I'm going here. There's also been aesthetic differences found in terms of syncopated jazz, which is very unpredictable, largely improvised, versus country music or even pop music, where it's a predictable, sometimes it's the chords G, D, and A, and it's just over and over again, and there's a predictable chorus, and you can predict where the bridge is coming in. That tends to be preferred by social and cultural conservatives. Again, explained through these psychological traits, this openness and tolerance for ambiguity and need for cognition. So, all of this is a long road that I'm taking you on to bring you to the fact that ironic satire and conservative outrage both capture the aesthetic preferences of the right and the left. So ironic satire captures the liberal aesthetic, right? And yes, I show this picture a lot because, my goodness, why would you not? If it's going to get you a smile, it's worth it. So my argument, yes, ironic satire captures the liberal aesthetic. How so? One, irony is inherently ambiguous. If you're tolerant of ambiguity, you will enjoy this. It is complex and ambiguous. It is actually, there have been neuropsychological studies looking at brain activity. Irony is very complicated to unpack. Cognitively speaking, there's multiple steps involved. This example I'll give you here. When Stephen Colbert says, ironically, folks, I love capital punishment, the death penalty in the United States. I love the death penalty. It sends a clear message. We as a society think it is depraved to take a human life, and to prove it, we're going to kill you. When he explicitly says, I love capital punishment, you have to be able to understand that there is an inherent incongruity in what he has said, that there is illogic there. It is hypocrisy in his statement. And when he delivers this line, he's very deadpan. You can't tell he's joking. You have to understand the inherent complexity and be willing to go along for the ride to unpack that. Okay. All that is to say that should be something that's more comprehended and appreciated by liberals than conservatives. In addition, irony is explicitly hybrid. If you're a conservative, you want things to be in categories. If you have a high need for closure, which is the opposite of tolerance for ambiguity, you are going to want everything to be in their category. But what is satire? What is John Oliver? Is he a journalist or is he a comedian? Is he just for fun or is he public affairs? He's a blend. He is hybrid. He makes jokes about jock straps and he presents crime statistics. What is he? That desire to understand how does he label himself might also make conservatives less inclined to express themselves that way and less appreciative of that kind of content. On the other hand, outrage, political talk, captures the conservative aesthetic. Didactic and clear and identifies threats. Every single night, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, who are their big hosts, are identifying threats, whether it be immigrants, liberals, liberal media. Here, these clips are from right around the election. President Trump was refusing to concede. Hannity said multiple times, Americans should be angry, outraged, and worried and concerned about what happened. Calling out journalists, saying journalists are complicit. Again, identifying threats in a very clear way, very serious way. He also, unlike comedians who are happy to be both entertainers and journalists, they don't care, they don't need a category. The outrage hosts, even though their shows are not technically journalism, because they're actually there designed to entertain, they do everything they can to hide that from their viewers. They do not like it when you call them entertainers, as evidenced by the fact that one Fox News host, who's on their news programming, called Hannity and the others entertainment. Hannity got mad. He tweeted in response, no, I break news. We do real news, trying to deny the fact that he is a hybrid genre. So if you take all of this information to its logical conclusion, I argue that exposure to content that is playful and experimental and ironic among people who have a high need for cognition and who are tolerant of ambiguity, this should increase their attention to the issues covered in the show, fuel all kinds of unguided exploration and information seeking. On the other hand, this kind of content here by Hannity and others that's threat-oriented and exaggerated, when it's consumed by people who need closure and who are efficient and emotional in their decision-making, it should shape, yes, issue attention, but also emotional responses, and it should fuel goal-driven persuasion and mobilization. These people are not just in it to think about things. These people want to take action. They are survivalists. They are efficient. The danger then, I propose, is in the fact that while satire is kind of like a wild raccoon, an untamable animal that might take aim at anyone at any moment, right? Outrage is a strategic, well-trained attack dog. Outrage can be used deliberately by people in power, as conservative outrage, I mean, to mobilize people towards a specific end. And in fact, during the Trump years, the very close relationship between Trump, Hannity, and the other Fox News analysis hosts was very clear. And he used them in part to mobilize his base towards the issues that were of interest to him. Building a wall between the US and Mexico, having a ban against people from predominantly Muslim nations, etc. So my final point before I leave you is that in the context of coronavirus, we could have hoped that conservative outrage might have said, you know what? We have viewers who are threat-oriented. We have viewers who are ready to take action. We could mobilize them to their own protection. We could get them concerned about COVID. We could urge them to wear masks. And we could use this in a very pro-social way. Unfortunately, they missed this great opportunity. Because Trump was president at the time, everything on Fox News was framed as though the Democrats were exaggerating the threat of the virus. The media were exaggerating the threat of the virus. They were using the virus as a political tool to harm Donald Trump. So much so that many of the viewers of Fox News came away either with a sense that COVID was a hoax, or that masks did not work, or that COVID was no more dangerous than the regular flu, all of which were more likely to be believed by Fox News viewers. This meant that in the US, especially this was last spring, you had Democrats significantly more likely than Republicans to take steps to avoid the virus and reduce its spread. Democrats were less likely to go to restaurants and less likely to make travel plans, were more likely to avoid gatherings, and more likely to be concerned about family. And right now, we're seeing the very same thing right now. Like, this is like just a few months ago. Tucker Carlson, and still today, is talking about his doubts about the vaccine, saying that the vaccine may not be effective. If they're telling us to wear masks after we're vaccinated, he says, maybe the vaccine doesn't work. Well, given the psychology of those audiences, you can imagine what this does in terms of mobilization and persuasion. Right now, the strongest issue that we have in terms of vaccine uptake in the United States is among white Republicans, especially white Republican males, who say they are unsure or they will not, or they will refuse to take the COVID vaccine. So those are some real world implications of what happens through the strategic use of conservative media right now in the context of COVID. So I know I've covered a lot, and I'm very excited to take your questions. So Marian, I'll hand it to you.
Super, thank you so much. This was excellent. Sorry again about the rough start with the presentation.
Sorry.
But you went through it, and it's we learned a lot. Thanks so much also for clarifying a lot of things for all the Germans in the audience who might not be aware of all the things. I think you did a fantastic job. So thanks. We do have some questions. I will just dive right in. And if everyone at home, if you still have some, please, now's the time to ask them. So first question starts with a thank you to you. And then this person goes on, do you think the people who consume media, like Hannity, Tucker Carlson, are aware of the fact that this is entertainment rather than news? And then I think it goes on. I think I remember some story that Tucker Carlson was accused of lying, and then Fox said something along the lines of, it's obvious that this is just an opinion.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Follow up, just to finish this, how do programs like these differ from propaganda?
I will say they don't, mainly because you're exactly right. A lot of the viewers do not know that there's sort of a different journalistic mandate on these shows. And, Pew Research Center in the United States is a nonpartisan research organization. They do some amazing work, and they have found that people have a very hard time distinguishing facts from opinion, just in general. And when you have an organization that sets up its television set to look like news, it has all of the trappings and all of the background of news, and it speaks with the seriousness and gravitas of news. How are you supposed to know if it's news or not? I mean, it all comes to you through that same channel. And I think it is very clear that a lot of folks who are consuming information from Fox News and leave it on all day, they don't know that there's actually 2 windows in the day when they can expect actual verifiable information, and that the rest of it is just entertainment. I don't think that they have any sense that that is the case. In fact, this is the same kind of argument that has been made. There have been lawsuits filed against Fox News and Fox News hosts by the Dominion election software company, basically saying that individuals who are on Fox lied about this software, suggested that it was exploited to try to rig the election, all of which is a lie. And in their defense, in their own defense, the folks from Fox are like, well, no, anyone who knows anything would know that we're just an opinion show. We're not saying it's true. I think that is a very, very difficult argument to make, and I'm really eager to see what happens with those lawsuits. Yeah.
Completely different direction, but I think we will come back to that point later. At what point in one's life is tolerance for ambiguity, need for cognition established? Are there effective interventions that have been studied and measured for increasing one's tolerance for ambiguity and need for cognition?
Great question, Emily. This is awesome. So it is thought that there is some research that points to the genetic components of these tendencies, that our physiological responses at a very primal level are then what shape how much we are concerned about threat. Therefore, they shape our psychological traits. That being said, those are not immutable. Those are not fixed, right? I mean, one of the things I'm very mindful of in my own work is we always have to honor the fact that individuals have free will. And really good work on genetics and genetic predispositions will always emphasize how individuals have free will. Genetics might make it more likely that you will find yourself in certain contexts or be interested in certain things, but they don't dictate that that is necessarily going to happen. So what I can say is that other piece of the question about whether or not, what was the second part? Interventions to shape these things. It actually is amazingly easy to do very quick experimental manipulations to change people's processing goals. It is very easy. There was one study, so I talk in the book about one study that got people to write about what it would feel like to be invincible, right? So they wrote this whole little paragraph about what it would feel like to be invincible, like a superhero that could never get hurt. Do you know what happened? Because their level of perceived threat was so much lower, because they had thought for a while about being invincible, it shifted their psychological sort of motivations to such an extent that it then resulted in more liberal political beliefs on matters like immigration. So if you got people to think about what it would feel like to be invincible, it actually resulted in these shifts. The other thing you can do is, if you get people to, there's wonderful work right now to try to curb misinformation online. And so David Rand and Gordon Pennycook have done a bunch of experiments trying to understand if you get people to slow down a little bit online, and you get them thinking about whether or not information is true, can you get them to stop sharing it? And that too, that does work. So you can prime kind of need for cognition or accuracy. Because if people are all about efficiency, they're just going to share whatever taps into their pre-existing beliefs. They're going to see something, they're going to see a headline, they're going to share it. Oh, that makes me feel good. I hate that guy. Share. But if you get them thinking, is it true? Does it have evidence? Is it right? They'll be less likely to share it. So all of these are motivational, so they're not completely fixed.
Right. Thank you so much. I like this question because you as a woman just presented this talk, and here someone's interested that it seems like neither liberal or conservative media outlets have strong female personalities. And why do you think is that? Maybe you can comment, is that even the case? Maybe we just don't know about any of them.
That is a great question. And I've never been asked that in the context of both genres. Absolutely right. I'll tell you though, there are several female outrage hosts that are quite popular. Laura Ingraham is a female outrage host, and Judge Jeanine Pirro is a female conservative outrage host, both on Fox. My sense, when I've been asked this question in the context of satire, I think we know that women are hilarious, period. The problem is perceptions of or appreciation for humor is so rooted in one's own sense of who is allowed to be powerful. Because the ability to make someone laugh is inherently powerful, right? And being willing to laugh at someone is vulnerable. That's a position of vulnerability. So, Marion, I guess now I'll get to say, one of the things I told Marion not to say at the outset was that I've done improv comedy for 25 years. Because when I say that, then everyone wants me to do like a comedy show. But this is my research. So I'll say, though, that having done improv comedy for 25 years, one of the most difficult crowds to entertain is a birthday party of like 20, 14-year-old boys. Anywhere between 11 and 14 years old. And in part, they'll laugh at all the males on stage. They'll laugh at every guy on stage. They will not allow themselves to laugh at a female comic. With, a few exceptions, but mostly they just do not want to laugh at a female comic. And I think that this is about willingness to perceive someone in a position of power. I need to think more about the question about why it does seem that men are dominating in both of these spaces. I am eager to see how the political comedy world is changing. Yes, the main shows on TV are hosted by guys. However, their writers are increasingly female, and there are a lot of amazing female comics and satirists that are coming up on smaller internet channels and things. So I think it is a matter of time.
Thank you for sharing that with the audience. I really wanted to tell everyone because I thought that was such a fascinating fact, but I totally agree. And we don't have like a red curtain, so I skipped that. Someone's just commenting, I think, that Rachel Maddow arguably is an outrage host.
Yes, great point. Great point, David. Let me just say, in the book, The Outrage Industry by Jeff Berry and Sarah Soberai that I talked about early on, they put Rachel Maddow and all of the other MSNBC shows. They're all outrage. Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes, Lawrence O'Donnell, all of those shows are outrage shows. I didn't have time to talk about that, but what's important to me is, number one, they are never as popular as the conservative outrage shows. They don't make as much money, and they don't have as many viewers. And number two, when you do a content analysis of those shows compared to the Fox outrage shows, in terms of how many times do they identify threats? How many times do they insult people? How much hyperbole do they use? All of these elements of outrage, MSNBC's outrage shows are a lot less outrageous than Fox News outrage shows. But that's absolutely true. You're absolutely right.
All right. Moving to another topic. Maybe we can come back to women later because it's very important that we do. You say that the ability to make people laugh is powerful, but I don't know any funny conservative shows, as we established, and not only on TV, but also animated. Are there any?
Well, Fox News, this is the whole point, really, is that, I have one chapter in my book where I look at when liberals have tried to make outrage and when conservatives have tried to make satire. And it just doesn't go so well. They're just not as great at it. And I think it's just because it's not as natural of a rhetorical expression for them. Fox News, believe it or not, actually gave one of their outrage hosts a comedy show called Gutfeld, the Greg Gutfeld Show. And it is supposed to be a comedy show, but I would challenge you to watch clips of it online and tell me if you think it is a comedy show or if it's just an outrage show with an occasional laugh track. So there aren't a lot.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. I've been asking myself this as well. So I'm very happy that you, as an expert, can share all this knowledge with us. Here's a question that I really think is also interesting. We've received similar question before. And this is, I guess, really relevant today also. Do you have any tips on how to approach someone, who is a believer of conspiracy theories and who believes in the information they get from Fox News or other right-wing networks?
That is excellent. Karia, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, but that you understand why I went from studying satire and outrage to now studying misinformation. So the work I'm doing right now is all about that very question. If we know that people are drawn to this content and they appreciate it and it satisfies different emotional needs or psychological needs, are there ways that we can approach those people and try to get them to reduce their misperceptions in a novel way? The problem is liberals will say, okay, I'm gonna talk to this person who watches Fox News and I'm just gonna show them the facts. I'm gonna show them the facts and the evidence. The problem there is that if you are talking to someone who's been watching a lot of Fox News that discredits experts and discredits institutions and discredits scientists, and you take to them evidence from scientists and experts and institutions, they're going to say, this is all fake news. This is all a lie. So instead, you need to recognize the need for an emotional connection, because a lot of what's going on, especially with conspiracy theory beliefs, is it's coming from a place of feeling out of control and scared. But also, conspiracy theory beliefs also come from feeling like a social outcast. So if you make fun of them, all you're going to do is push them farther in the direction of a conspiracy theory. But if you talk to them with love and respect, and you see them and you honor where those needs are coming from, their emotional needs and psychological needs, you might be able to create the kind of relationship to undo some of those beliefs.
Right. I hope that answered the question. There are more coming in. A different direction here. Could you address the huge success of alternative media, i.e., someone's an expert here, the Joe Rogan podcasts that are often considered conservative and also come from a comedy background?
Yes. Yeah, great point. I was actually just on Twitter, a couple of friends of mine who study misinformation and disinformation just put out a Washington Post piece about the fact that Joe Rogan, I think it was yesterday or the day before, talked about how he doesn't think that young people should get vaccinated. And they have some evidence that suggests that his sowing the seeds of doubt in his listeners' minds for months is correlated with lower vaccine intentions among his listeners. So really, really interesting stuff. So I'll tell you what, part of when I approached the question of why satire is liberal, it wasn't to say that all humor is liberal. It wasn't to say that all comedy is liberal. Satire, the mechanism that makes satire work most frequently is that of irony, because you're juxtaposing the ideal world and the real world, or you're juxtaposing what ought to be with what actually is. So irony itself, by describing the world as though it's perfect when what you mean is it's terrible, or vice versa, that is a wonderful tool to imply something without saying it. And that's what satire often uses. Some entertainers or hosts like Joe Rogan, who are funny, right? They're often using not the tool of irony, but the tool of hyperbole, or they're using just silliness or play. And I think that's an important distinction. You could even say that the famous political talk host, Rush Limbaugh, was very funny. He was completely outrageous. He insulted people and said some very offensive jokes, but his listeners found them very funny. And a lot of that is humor that's generated through overstatement, which I see as, and actually there's research that shows that's cognitively distinct from irony, because it doesn't take that same kind of layered processing.
All right. We have talked about this before this event today, that a lot of people in Germany, and especially young people, they turn to late night shows such as Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, etc., and to get actual their information. That's the news source, so to speak. And do you agree? Is this the right way for people to get informed about what's happening in the United States? Or is there anything else that you recommend watching for that matter?
Yeah, so I studied this very question in 2006 and tried to understand, first of all, is that fair? Can you say that? Is that what's happening? The Pew Research Center had asked people how often they received news about politics from late night comedy shows and from satire shows, and young people were significantly more likely to say that they did receive information from those shows. And young people were less likely to say that they were receiving information from traditional news. There's two problems with that. One is some people are going to be more likely to admit deriving political information and meaning from entertainment. I think because younger people don't feel like a social pressure to get their information from a particular place, they're more likely to say, sure, I get political information from Trevor Noah. That's one problem. Another piece of that is that when you ask people where do they get information, people are terrible self-reporters. I mean, if I say to you, hey, where did you first learn that Bill and Melinda Gates are getting divorced? Maybe you just learned it from me just now. I don't know. But if I ask you that, actually, even though did I just tell you that, Marion?
No, I learned it from the New York Times.
Ah, okay. Are you sure? You're totally sure.
Yes.
So now, even though that just was announced yesterday, I don't remember where I first heard it. I don't know where I got that. We are very bad at tracing where we got information. So what I did was I looked at actual political knowledge rates among people who watch the different shows. What I found was that people who consumed the late night comedy shows and satire shows at that time actually had higher levels of political knowledge than people who were consuming other kinds of news, controlling for age and education and gender and all that. I also found that the people who were consuming these satire shows, like The Daily Show, were also watching or reading other kinds of news. They were more likely to be consuming information from multiple sources. So that tells me that there's no way that their main source of information is just from the satire shows. And a lot of times you need a little bit of background information to understand the jokes in the first place. So if you're coming in with nothing, you wouldn't really understand them.
But the studies that you're referring to, are they focusing on a U.S. audience?
Yes, or just U.S.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Because it's interesting to see and compare that, because I think here a lot of people think it's cool to watch late night comedy, and that a lot of times triggers them to then get additional information because you realize that maybe I didn't get that joke. Why is that? So
that is true. You are absolutely right. So there is an effect called the gateway hypothesis, where yes, entertainment shows and late night shows can serve as a gateway because you hear about something and you're like, I did not get that joke. And then you Google it, you look it up, you read an article in the New York Times. So it's a gateway. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Moving on, now questions are coming in. Do you think that there is a possibility to bring people together again through those shows? Or are they going to separate and polarize more and more and get lost in their own opinion to the point that they stop talking to each other?
Yeah, that is a great point. One of my concerns as I watched the late night comedy hosts during the Trump years was that there was so much raw anger in their programs that they themselves were becoming outrage. Samantha Bee's show, Jimmy Kimmel's show, even Stephen Colbert. And I thought that strikes me as, and it makes sense psychologically, because there is now a perception of threat, a very salient threat to progressive values and democratic values, etc. diversity, etc. It makes sense that because they have a heightened threat, they're going to be less likely to engage in the state of play. That makes sense. But I feel like over time that would be catastrophic. One of the things that we talk about in journalism and in functional healthy journalism is the need to have journalism that is explicitly anti-authoritarian, explicitly pro-democratic. Journalism that doesn't just tell both sides of a story when one side of the story wants democracy to die. Journalism that doesn't tell both sides of the story when one side of the story wants to deny human rights. There are some things that you have to place as centerpieces, right? Democratic health, human rights. If we could find content that had that at its center and accepted that and moved from there, I think that would put us in a better spot. Whether it be journalism, entertainment. Interestingly, I've seen some shows that are both comedy and drama, a little drama, that use storytelling and narrative to get the viewers absorbed in ways that will tend to get us to be more open-minded. That's another psychological effect of media. And do so in a way that shows empathy and openness to different kinds of people and different ways of life. I can't wait to see who is going to do the study of Schitt's Creek. I don't know if you've watched Schitt's Creek, which is a Canadian show, which is available on Netflix. But that is one such show that I think has the ability to transcend categories and be appreciated across the political spectrum.
All right, thanks. Was that the ice truck that just came by your house?
That was the ice cream truck. Did you hear it?
Yes.
I warned Marion ahead of time. I said, I don't know if you have ice cream trucks that like play music all day, but there's one that goes by my house. So.
I'm so glad you ordered it just for us. This makes this more fun. We need like elements of humor to go along with this program.
There you go.
Okay, we have 18 minutes left and a couple of questions. Someone wants to ask another question here. I hope it's okay if I'm asking another question. Yes. But I was wondering what you think about excluding public figures like Trump or Mike Lindell from social media platforms. Is it the right step to stop misinformation from spreading, or do you think it is harmful to free speech?
Yeah. This is something that I think is very challenging because, number one, we do not want our governments to have the capacity to regulate mis and disinformation or censor it at the level of the government. When you actually look at the nations that have misinformation and disinformation policies, strict policies, they're not democratic countries, right? So having strict censorship rules for government to censor speech on social media tends to be an anti-democratic kind of behavior. Because who gets to decide what's true and what's not? The government. Well, if you're in China, what's not true? Anything that's not favorable towards the Chinese government, therefore that constitutes misinformation. Okay. But when we're talking about privately owned social media platforms, I think it's quite a different conversation because of the nature of power. In the US right now, Facebook does have a disproportionate amount of power. And so when we're talking about Facebook censoring Donald Trump or censoring the My Pillow guy, it still is a really interesting question because Facebook is so culturally, socially, and fiscally powerful. My thought on Trump in particular is this. When they made the decision to suspend his account on January 6th, it was because of a sense of imminent threat, imminent physical violence. And because even when Trump was called upon to call off the dogs, to make his people go home, he continued to double down and he continued to incite. Even though he said, go home in peace, he continued to incite violence. So when the reason that Facebook is very reluctant to police misinformation and disinformation is, yes, because of free speech interests, but it's mainly because it's very hard to understand the difference between someone who knowingly is spreading false information or who just happens to believe something that's not true. You cannot get in someone's head. You cannot determine whether or not someone really believes something or if they're doing something strategically. And they do not want to get in the habit of taking down information that people truly believe is true, but just happens to not be true. Because everyone is entitled to their opinion. The problem in the context of the Trump situation, I'm not sure about the Mike Lindell one, I haven't thought about that one, but with Trump is that Facebook itself, the conceit of Facebook, right, is connecting people in ways that will facilitate some kind of societal progress, right? Like that's like the big pie in the sky. And to give voice to people that haven't had a voice. Trump has a voice. Trump will always have a voice. Trump does not need a Facebook account to have a voice. And by giving a voice, further voice to Trump in that context, that is something where there's disproportionate harm that could come of that because he has time and time again proved to be a node or a fueling device for mis and disinformation. So, you know, the Facebook Oversight Board is about to announce, maybe today, May 5th, is that today? Is about to announce their decision, today's the 4th, okay, on whether or not they're going to support the permanent banning of Donald Trump from the platform. And I am very eager to see what they decide because it's a unique case because it's a political leader.
All right. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. So thank you for commenting. I think this is a question that is also highly debated and discussed here. And so it's very interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Could I add another thought to that? So I don't want to be perceived as though I am like punting or avoiding the question itself. We have been so concerned, I say we, as a discipline with looking at mis and disinformation on the side of the supply of mis and disinformation online and on political media channels. My sense is we will never be able to solve this problem on the side of supply because there will always be more supply. We're not going to be able to have, you know, accounts suspended and content moderators who take down individual posts in a way that is adequate to address this issue large scale and long term. So the work that I'm doing right now is trying to figure out how we address this issue on the side of demand, because that is the problem. People are demanding this content. People derive emotional and psychological comfort from this content. And sometimes some of the research is showing that people are sharing information and stories that they know to be false, but that might as well be true because they tap into larger truths about the world that they believe in. So, well, this story might not be true, but it might as well be true because it captures a dynamic that is true. And that's where I think that we need to focus our attention. So that's my work right now, is looking at ways that we can curb demand for the misinformation.
And so if we wait a couple of years, we can read all about that in Wrong.
That's right. That's
right. Okay, well, we'll just have to wait a little bit then.
Oh, so someone asked if that's a dog. Yeah, that's
yeah.
That's Lucy.
She just moved also.
Oh, she did. Oh, snuggling. Okay.
All right. Since you talked about the fairness doctrine before, and we have a couple of minutes left, a question: if the problem of polarization has become so obvious in the past years in the United States, why wasn't the fairness doctrine reinstated? And do you think it could help?
I think the reason that the fairness doctrine was not reinstated is because the fairness doctrine it was sort of an artifact of the technology of broadcast, where when radio was invented and then television, it was making use of a finite array of spectra or frequencies to be able to assign stations to certain frequencies, right? So basically, it wasn't like anybody in the world could just create a television station or a radio station, because there was a finite supply. So you had to be licensed by the government, which also meant, because it's a finite supply, because you're being licensed by the government, you need to give equal treatment to multiple sides of a story. With cable news and the possibility of like infinite outlets, it does change the sort of internal technological logic, because it's not as though there is a finite supply. There's an infinite supply of places where you can have your point of view heard and known, especially now with the internet. Can you imagine if they said about the internet, hey, we're going to bring back the fairness doctrine, so your website needs to have all of the points of view? I mean, the whole web would break. The internet would just drown. So that's pretty much why that changed, but it also was at that moment when Reagan was president and we were in an era of deregulation of all kinds of industries. And so it was sort of the ideal time, because cable had changed the technological landscape and the administration was looking to deregulate. That's why they did that. But I can't imagine a justification that someone could bring up to say we need it back, or we should have it back.
All right. So, and it's also not openly discussed then, is it? I mean, it's been gone.
No, you hear people talk about it online, comments and things, but I think it's because I don't think people really understand why the fairness doctrine was there before.
All right. So I hope that answered our guest questions. What is your, you can maybe talk a little bit longer about this. What is your prediction for the future in this media landscape? Are there similar phenomenons on the internet?
Yeah. So I don't usually do predictions, mainly because I think I would always be wrong. Instead, I do recommendations. I always talk about what I hope to see, and the criteria that I use to shape what I hope to see is criteria rooted in democratic health, period. What I hope to see is, and this might actually surprise you, but more than I think we need to witness changes at the level of media content or changes at the level of media policy or media technologies. We need to see changes at the level of political elites. The reason I say that is the kind of discourse that is rewarded, the kind of behaviors that are deemed acceptable, the way that we think about our democratic institutions, the respect for journalism, all of that comes most potently from the language and behaviors of our elected officials. So now there is this awful little feedback loop where when you have elected officials who are saying that all the news is fake and that the world is flat and vaccines are a hoax or whatever, when you have elected officials like that, of course, then that will give legitimacy or allow the conspiracy theorists to have a little more fuel, right? So that will drive their content. So that, of course, there is some influence coming from media content, but the great disruption in all of this madness, the great disruption could come from a change at the level of elite political leaders. There's two of my friends who are political scientists who I quote all the time because their work is so important, Lily Mason and Nathan Kalmo, have been working on questions of under what conditions people support political violence. Under what conditions do people think that political violence is justified? That is, using violence to political ends. And it is shocking that they have done these tiny little experimental interventions that have huge effects. Do you know what they found is that if you tell people Joe Biden is calling for unification, Joe Biden is saying, things like liberals and conservatives, we all have common goals. We're all good people. We all want a great country. We have some shared values. If you give people that statement, both liberals and conservatives will become less likely to say that political violence is justified. Same with Trump. If you tell people that Trump said it. Now, obviously, the words are more potent when they're from your own side, right? They're more influential when they're from your own side, but they do influence both sides. So this language of unification that people are like, oh, that's all fake. Oh, it's so political. No. We crave that because it does work. We crave our leaders coming together. We crave them engaging with one another. We crave them talking about unification because we recognize, especially in the US where we only got two parties, that's it, right? That's all we got. So if they can't talk to each other, what do we have? The bottom falls out. So the reason that we crave it is because it does work, and that can increase democratic health.
All right. I think we are coming to an end slowly, but we still have some minutes. I'm not sure if you saw this last questions, which is also quite interesting, especially here in Germany. Do you think concept like public broadcasting could help?
Yes. Yes. So someone who has been influential in this space, in my thinking, he's at the University of Pennsylvania, Victor Piccard, writes a lot about the economics of journalism. And he makes a very, very strong argument that modern democracies cannot survive without a robust, well-funded public journalistic enterprise that does not have to compete for eyeballs, that does not have to be sensationalized for ratings, and that operates completely independently of the government, even though it gets money from taxes. So many folks over the years have called upon the US government to rethink how we fund public broadcasting. The culture war between liberals and conservatives right now has put our public broadcasting system as the enemy of conservatism. It is seen as just the bastion of liberalism. And so it's become so entrenched in this political war that I'm not sure how we extract ourselves from that, but it would hugely help.
Right. So we can watch and see what happens in the future. We have one final question, and I think, I'll just read it, and maybe it's a nice frame for you. What do you think would change if liberals would be more outraged and do more political talk, and the other way around?
Oh, say it again.
What would change if liberals would be more outraged and do more political talk, and the other way around?
So if liberals were more outraged and did more political talk, this is tricky because I don't know that content then would resonate as much with their audiences. There are a lot of liberals who feel very turned off by folks like Rachel Maddow because they perceive that she's so strident and so didactic and so over the top. And liberals, because they're high in need for cognition, liberals like feeling as though they're putting the pieces together themselves, and they don't like feeling like they're being told what they should think. They like feeling like they come up with it on their own. So I don't know if that would work. On the other hand, for conservatives to do comedy, like I said, I invite you to tune in to the new show on Fox, Gutfeld. Watch the clips online, and you tell, because the goal of that show is for it to be a late night comedy show. That is the goal, the stated goal. I will leave it to you to see how you think they are doing.
All right, so we all have some homework, and can go from this talk and see what we think of that. I apologize that we didn't get to all the questions. I just wanted to thank you so much, Dana, for taking the time, for talking to us. We're super excited that you decided to join us. We hope that at some point we can welcome you in Stuttgart, so you can maybe take some pictures and share them with your dad. And so you can exchange experiences.
I would love it. Now, sadly, I wouldn't be able to bring Lucy, so I'll give you one last look at my puppy. But yeah,
she was incredibly quiet.
That's good.
Even when the ice cream truck came.
Right.
So we're very glad. So thank you. I also want to thank, as always, our audience for joining us, participating, sending us your questions. Also, of course, the University of Hohenheim for cooperating, especially Professor Brettschneider, and also my colleague, Max, for the technical support. I just wanted to say again, if you're at home interested in this research, I recommend that you check out Dana's book, Irony and Outrage, as mentioned before. And if you're interested in our events, we have a lot of programs coming up. In May, we are offering some programs focusing on immigration. We will do a talk about the empowerment of immigrants and refugees on May 18th. We have a very interesting panel from Baden-Württemberg in California. And also on May 20th, we are going to do an America special for students focusing on immigration in the US. And then also next Monday on May 10th, we are offering our head-to-head series with the American Academy in Berlin. And the focus there will be migration and immobility across the Red Sea. And so, as always, you can find all of that information online. Just one last piece of information. We are also offering virtual language classes at the moment. They are going to happen during the upcoming break at the end of May. And there will be 2 classes, both of which will be taught by our American teachers via Zoom, and you can still register until May 20th. And so that's all the advertisement for tonight. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, for listening in. And Dana, thanks so much again. I hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you. It was a great honor to have been invited. So thank you for letting me share my work with you.